This is this between us.
The number one podcast in the world.
This is just between us with your host, Camo.
All right, how's it going, everybody? My name is Chris. This is Just Between Us. Forgive me, I'm still getting my stuff together here. I was not prepared to continue recording, but just as I finished the show yesterday, the news broke about the shooting in Greenwood in Indiana, and I have just so much that I want to say. Let's first we want to recognize and take a second for the victims. There were 3 people killed in this shooting. Pedro and his wife Rosa Pineda, and they were 56 and 37, and Victor Gomez, who was 30 years old. The shooting suspect, who has been identified, whose name I'm not going to mention though, was 20 years old. According to the reports, he entered the mall. He entered the mall food court, immediately went into the bathroom where he spent nearly an hour preparing. There's not a whole lot of detail as to what or why, or if he entered with the firearms. I assume the firearms were probably in a bag or something, and that is why he went into the restroom. But I don't know. There's no specifics on that. He then exited the restroom after about an hour and shot the first victim, Victor Gomez, and then fired on the second 2 victims, killing them, and then began to shoot into the food court. Thankfully, despite 3 killed and 2 injured within the first 2 minutes of the shooting, a 22-year-old bystander who was shopping at the mall with his girlfriend, Elisjsha Dicken, who was from Seymour, Indiana, happened to be concealed carrying thanks to Indiana's passing the constitutional carry law. Dicken fired 10 rounds from his Glock handgun, killing the gunman before he was able to harm or kill anybody else. Just upon him firing at the gunman immediately began retreating from his rampage. And I want to break this down a little bit more here in a second, but before we get to that, there's some things we need to say, some things we need to go over. Obviously, everybody is horrified at the fact this has happened yet again. And yet again, it is in a gun-free zone. The mall is considered a gun-free zone. They do not allow firearms on the premises. That this has taken place. And we cannot keep ignoring the fact. You can want to ban assault weapons. You can want to do any other gun control thing. That's fine. What you cannot ignore is the fact that these always take place in a gun-free zone. And thank God, Elisjsha Dicken ignored this gun-free zone and carried his own firearm in. A lot of people like to point out the fact that concealed carriers, good guys with guns, security guards, off-duty police officers rarely stop these shooting incidents. And that is because these deranged fucking cowards always choose gun-free zones and intentionally try to target places that they do not believe concealed carriers will either be or at least have their firearms. The manifesto from the shooter in not Buffalo, but the other New York shooting that happened on a street corner. I can't think of the name at the moment, but his manifesto specifically outlined this, as have many others before. They choose the guns that they choose because they know it'll bring the most headlines. They choose the places that they choose because they think they will be able to shoot as many people as possible without being stopped. Gun-free zones are killing people. And I'm not suggesting that is the only factor that matters. I'm not suggesting that eliminating them is the only course of action. There are certainly plenty of others. But it's time we move past this. This is the first situation in quite a while, besides the shooting on the street, which happened in a city that is a gun-free zone. New York, up until this recent Supreme Court case, which then New York hurried up and passed a bunch of other laws to basically ensure the same thing. Nobody is allowed to carry handguns in New York, which is why nobody was able to stop that. You might say that wasn't in a gun-free zone. Not necessarily. It did start at a store that was a gun-free zone, which was specifically mentioned by the shooter in his manifesto. One of these days we might go through that. I didn't feel that it was a good idea, particularly close to the shooting, for one. For two, we certainly don't want to encourage anybody else. But I think there's a lot to be learned. As tough as it is to read some of that manifesto, there's a lot to be learned there, particularly for people wanting to stop these shootings. And I think that as hard as it may be to go through some of that information, it might save some lives. So with a little more time in between, we might just do that. But let's get back to what happened in Greenwood. While the mall is a gun-free zone, it is not a place that has metal detectors or that it is particularly enforced. Anybody that's ever been into a mall would know how easy it is, so long as you don't tell anybody that you're carrying and your gun is not open, visible to somebody. And even if it was, the chances that somebody's going to confront you about it are pretty low. Thanks to that, there happened to be somebody carrying there who, according to police, was very proficient in his use of firearms. He engaged the shooter from a particularly long distance, according to the police officer. And he was able to immediately, from the second he fired his first shot, stop the shooter from causing harm. Took him 10 rounds to eventually kill the shooter. But from the second he fired his first shot, the shooter's attention went from hurting people to fleeing. I have said it many times before on this show, but this is a really specific call to action that I want to give you today. Anybody that has the capability to concealed carry, whether you already have your permit, you can get your permit, or you're in a state where it does not require a permit, do so. Don't do it on occasion. Don't do it every once in a while. Only something like 3% of people who conceal carry do so on a daily basis. Carry your firearm. Be responsible with it and train with it. Train with it often. Be ready to use it if the time comes. Regardless of the situation, there's no guarantee that a good guy with a gun is going to be able to stop a mass shooting. In the opportunities that have arisen, The last one that comes to my mind is Sutherland Springs, where unfortunately the shooter was able to accomplish his initial goal, but a good guy with his own AR-15 brought an end to that. That the shooter was leaving this church, headed to another church to continue shooting. And I can't remember his name at the moment, and I'm really sorry for that because it deserves to be said at every opportunity. He grabbed his own AR-15, he confronted the shooter the second he came out of that church, and then he chased him down the road and prevented him from carrying on his attack, just as Elisjsha Dicken did in this situation. There was no reason he had to go put his life in danger. He wasn't in front of the shooter when the shooting broke out. He ran to the shooter. Him and his girlfriend could have escaped that mall and been in no more danger. He chose to go and engage the shooter and put an end to it. And when that shooter fled, he shot him while he was out in the food court. The shooter immediately retreated to the bathroom where he had started, and he did not die until he got into that bathroom where he collapsed to the floor. Elisjsha continued to pursue him until he was sure that shooter was down. This 22-year-old kid is a hero. And it's not really fair for me to call him a kid, but there were plenty of other people. Had that shooter had the opportunity to continue his rampage, that were likely to be victims of him. And Elisjsha could have protected himself and ran out of that mall, and he chose instead to be a first responder and engage the shooter. Like I said, within the first 2 minutes, it was just over a minute that it took him to assess where the shots were coming from, run to the location, and engage the shooter. Far faster than police ever could have arrived, and did in this scenario. Carry your firearm. Be responsible with it, and be prepared and well-trained. If we want these things to stop, we know as gun owners, and in general as conservatives, that the only sure way to protect our children in schools and to protect our friends and our family is to harden up these locations. We know for sure that that is the only guaranteed way to help protect them. And it's still not perfect. Evil will still be able to harm people, no matter how many laws we pass, no matter how many gun-free zones there are, and no matter how many concealed carriers are carrying their firearms. Evil will still be able to harm people. But our best chance is to be able to fight fire with fire in the moment. So if you have a handgun or have a concealed carry permit and are a legal law-abiding citizen who is responsible with your firearms, and you're choosing not to carry it every day, you are actively choosing to not be a part of the solution. Long before any of these policymakers get around to doing fucking anything, long before anything, we can do this today. Unfortunately, in most states, schools remain gun-free zones where an off-duty police officer, a competition shooter, right, anybody that's well-trained and proficient cannot volunteer their time to protect the school. However, there is nearly an unlimited list of other places where we can begin to be prepared today. And I want to be really clear. I'm not calling for vigilantism. I shouldn't have to fucking say this because it's obvious. All I'm calling for is preparedness. And if you already possess these skills and the necessary credentials, and you're choosing not to utilize them on a daily basis, you need to do so. If you have any interest whatsoever in contributing towards the solution. It is almost unquestionable that the actions of Dicken, at the very least, protected the lives of the two victims who were shot but not killed, including a 12-year-old girl whose parents identified her as with the first name Bella. They were unable to completely flee the store. They had to hide. And given more time waiting for police to arrive, that shooter very well could have found them again. I apologize for all the silence here. Normally I would cut that out, but I really wanted to make sure that this got recorded today. I don't usually have the opportunity to put out more than one recording in a week, but this needed to be covered. And part of why this needs to be covered is because I know, despite the fact the media reported on it last night, because they had to, because it instantly started going viral, obviously, no, probably by today, I haven't seen any information on it today. Any other shooting, I would see pages of. The shooter used an AR-15. He had multiple 30-round magazines. They're trying to pass assault weapons ban in Congress right now. You think they wouldn't be hammering this home if it wasn't for Elisjsha Dicken stopping this shooting? An armed citizen who was not a police officer? Of course they would. I'm willing to bet by tomorrow there's not a peep of this in anywhere other than pro-gun rights publications. And that's a shame, because this was a shooting that was successfully stopped. It wasn't prevented, but there's no way we're ever going to prevent all of them. But it was successfully stopped in under 2 minutes. This should be shared 100-fold to a shooting that was unable to be. Because this offers at least the best solution we have thus far. Like I said, it's not a perfect solution and it's not the only one. But none of these other shootings were stopped that quickly. Obtain a concealed carry permit, or if you live in a constitutional carry state, good for you. Train with your firearm, take classes, spend time focusing and really working on those skills. I can't tell you the amount of, particularly older, the younger guys tend to be pretty good about this stuff. And part of that has to do with a lot of this information. There didn't used to be so much information out there for self-defense training. There was police and there was military, but self-defense, the best you could do was obtain your permit, get a firearm, and, that was it. There wasn't a whole lot of training. You went to the range, you shot at the little paper target, you did your best to be accurate. There is unlimited amounts of information now out there online and in the real world of classes and drills that you can run, and what type of ammo to carry, what type of firearm will be most effective, how to safely carry, how to avoid being charged if you have to use your firearm in self-defense of yourself or others. There is so much out there now. And what I was saying is, particularly the older guys, but the amount of people I know that still operate under previous falsehoods about firearms. They don't understand, anything that's necessary. They don't ever train. The amount of people that obtain a concealed carry permit and carry around a firearm that they have never fired more than a box of ammunition through is too many. I have handguns that I have fired 50,000 rounds of ammunition through training. And that sounds like a lot. It's not. 1,000 rounds a week for a year, which I understand is far more than most people are going to do. But that's all it took to reach that number. At the very least, 3 or 4 times a year, you should be training with your firearm. And I do not mean going to the range and shooting holes in a piece of paper. I mean training with it. And if you need to do that in classes, or if you need to reach out for further support because you're not quite sure where to start or how to go, you can email me, jbu@usa.com. I will help point you in the right direction. Or, there's literally an unlimited amount of resources out there. But you need to be training, doing drills, understanding how to draw your firearm, how to do it quickly, how to engage a target, how to assess a threat to ensure that you're actually shooting at a threat and not putting innocent bystanders in harm's way, right? Just imagine, though, how many of these public shooters would encounter a concealed carrying person. It's still going to be limited because they intentionally choose places where they are pretty sure somebody is not going to be armed. But keep in mind, this shooter was engaged while 3% of permit holders, so not just firearms owners, but of the smaller segment of permit holders, carry their firearm on a daily basis. Imagine if that was 50%. 100%. If you can lawfully carry your firearm and you've taken the time to train on how to use it, when to engage a threat, how to be proficient with it, carry your firearm on a daily basis, and then continue to train as often as possible. I tell people that I personally work with that are interested. I've helped train several people at this point. I tell them they need to spend at least 1 day a month working on these skills, even if that's just dry fire training at home. And that's the thing. Shooting can be expensive, especially the last couple years when ammo prices have been through the roof. However, much of self-defense training can be done with strictly dry fire practice. And see, this is the thing about the gun community. There's still so many people believe that dry firing your gun will harm it. Now, if it's a historical piece, I understand. But if it's a modern firearm, you can absolutely dry fire it. You should dry fire it 10 times for every real bullet you shoot. 100 times for every real bullet you shoot. The only exception to that rule is some older firearms, and I'm talking way older. If it's post 90s, it's almost certainly okay. So historical firearms, and then 22 caliber firearms, which you shouldn't be carrying a 22 pistol for self-defense anyway. But that is where the concern from dry fire originally comes from. And it's actually not just 22, it's all rim fire ammunition. So that includes 17 HMR, 22 Magnum, older 22s, because the firing pin hits the rim of the case. Sometimes the firearms were designed to where that without a bullet in the chamber, that firing pin would smack the side of the chamber, and eventually that would mushroom the tip of that firing pin out, which could cause a jam. It's still not going to cause catastrophic malfunction of the weapon. You'll need a new firing pin, but it's not going to harm the gun. It won't shoot until you replace the firing pin, but it's no big deal at all. It's not like it's going to crack your barrel or some crazy thing like that. But most rimfire 22s even are designed with dry fire in mind. My buddy's got a precision 17 HMR. I think it's a Ruger precision, and it says right in the book that it's perfectly safe to dry fire. If you're ever unsure, check your book. But just about any center fire cartridge you can dry fire. And like I said, just about any modern firearm you can dry fire. And you should be doing it. Most of these drills you will get proficient at dry firing rather than actually shooting. All right, I've hammered that home enough. Let's go ahead and let's dig a little deeper into this situation. Particularly, I want to go over CNN's coverage of this, because, of course, it's ridiculous. I mean, they have no out. They have to mention the fact that Elisjsha Dicken was able to stop the shooting within 2 minutes, but they want to make sure you know that that's a diamond in the rough and that legislation is the only way to solve these things, which is absolute horseshit. They just passed legislation the other day. Once again, made no difference in this scenario. This kid had no prior indicators. As always, it was a complete shock to the family. Nobody felt that he was upset in any way or posed any danger to anyone. The only thing that had happened to him recently was he had been served an eviction notice because he chose to quit his job. I assume that I made a little bit of an assumption there, because we know the information that he quit his job and then he received an eviction notice. So it wasn't some, unforeseen thing that took him out of the blue, it doesn't seem. He was able to legally purchase all 3 firearms that he had, 2 of which were AR-style rifles. He had an M&P 15 and a 6-hour M400, according to the article, and around 100 rounds, so probably 3 magazines of ammunition. He also had a Glock pistol. Both firearms were purchased in March of this year. They were purchased legally, meaning he went through a background check. It wasn't, some gun show loophole that he swiggled through or anything like that. The background check failed to stop this kid from purchasing a gun. 2 guns. 3 guns in this case. I don't know what further laws Indiana has, but I know that he had to go through a background check. He had to have ID. Let's see, he was 20 years old, so he could have potentially waited, a couple months longer, and the 21-year-old law wouldn't have stopped him, which I think, I have other problems with that law anyway. I do acknowledge that, sure, if somebody is 18 years old and they want to do this, they will not be able to legally purchase a gun that potentially could make it harder for somebody 18, 19, 20 years old to do this. Potentially. There's still a million other ways to illegally obtain firearms, though. And one could reasonably wait a few months. They clearly plan these things out for long periods of time. We know that. Waiting a little longer is not necessarily going to stop them at all. I want to go ahead and read a portion of CNN's article on the shooting to point out a couple things. I'm going to start right here just because I want to say it again, really. The Greenwood Police Department has trained for mass shooting scenarios and has performed multiple mall exercises to prepare for shooter simulate situations, the police chief said. But I'm going to tell you, the real hero of the day is the citizen that was lawfully carrying a firearm in that food court and was able to stop this shooter almost as soon as he began, said the police chief. CNN continues, it's rare to have an armed bystander attack an active shooter, according to data from the Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response Training at Texas State University. There were at least 434 active shooter attacks from 2000 to 221, according to the alert data. Active shooter attacks were defined as those in which one or more shooters killed or attempted to kill multiple unrelated people in a populated place, which, as we've talked about in previous episodes, is a far better definition of a mass shooting. And I'll explain that here in a second because they're going to make the point for me. Of those 434 active shooter cases, an armed bystander shot the attacker in 22 of those incidents. So, that is a very small percentage, obviously. 22 of, what was it, 434? Yeah, 434. That's 5% of the time. Who knows how many lives were saved in that 5% of the time? But it's 5% of the time. So 5% of the time, 3% of concealed carriers who daily carry stopped a mass shooting. And that could include, I don't know for sure, but that could include off-duty police. That can include security guards, on duty or off duty, right? That can just be an average civilian. Any one of those can be concealed carriers. But if only 3% carry on a daily basis, and they're still able to stop 5% of shootings, it's 97 or 99% of which happen in gun-free zones where a law-abiding citizen would be prosecuted for carrying his firearm in. Just imagine if 100% were doing so, how big we can make that number. Just multiplying it out, you would get somewhere around 100% would be stopped. Now, I don't think that it would actually be 100% because most of these happen in gun-free zones. But maybe 20%, 30%, 60%, who knows? Anyway, they continue. And having more, this is where it really starts to piss me off. The last sentence says, having more than one armed person at the scene who is not a member of law enforcement can create confusion and carry dire risks, according to data analysis published by the New York Times. For example, an armed bystander who shot and killed an attacker in 2021, Colorado, was himself shot and killed by the police who mistook him for the gunman. And that's absolutely true, and that is a risk you take in stopping the shooting. But I can guarantee almost anybody that's willing to run towards gunfire, police or not, are willing to accept that risk in order to protect other people's lives. I can tell you I would far rather be accidentally shot by police stopping a mass shooter than my kid being hurt, or my wife being hurt, or my family or friends being hurt because I didn't act. That shooting in Colorado was tragic. However, what they failed to mention here is before that heroic man, Jonathan Hurley, was shot by a police officer when he was mistaken for the gunman, he killed the gunman before he had a chance to kill anybody else. You may not remember, but in that situation, police officers were attempting to contact a man who they had gotten a welfare check request on because a family member had called and said that he was planning on doing something crazy. Police officer made contact with the man, who then immediately turned and shot the police officer I'm summarizing a bit here, but Jonathan Hurley witnessed this, as did 3 other officers that happened to be nearby doing something else. As those officers prepared to confront the suspect, Hurley did confront the suspect. He shot and killed the man who had just killed the police officer and was heading to a public area to kill more people with his rifle. Jonathan shot and killed him. He picked up the suspect's rifle as he holstered his pistol, which then caused the one of the 3 police officers that was nearby, who had just been coming around to attempt to confront the suspect. He saw that Jonathan was holding the rifle and fired on him. He made a mistake, and I don't blame the police officer for doing so, but it was tragic. Nonetheless, it was still a concealed carrier that stopped that man from killing another police officer or another person. There was another situation at a Walmart. There's been multiple shootings at Walmarts that have been deterred or stopped by concealed carriers because Walmart is not a gun-free zone. Walmart basically operates under a don't ask, don't tell policy. And there's been multiple scenarios, including one in my home state, where concealed carriers were able to stop active shooters. This happened in Tumwater, Washington. I don't see a date here. 2018 is what it says. A man is dead and his victims alive because of the quick-thinking efforts of 2 concealed carriers who happened to be in the area of his rampage. I don't know why we live in a very liberal state, particularly this side of the state. And while there have been, actually just recently, there were laws passed, which I talked about in a previous episode. But there have been several attempts at gun control, plenty of rhetoric about it. We actually have fairly robust, they are withering away at them slowly, but we have fairly robust gun protections here because of our state constitution, which mimics the federal constitution. It's very, very strong, so it's made it difficult for them to pass really restrictive legislation. But despite all that, there happens to be, at least it seems to me, a pretty strong gun culture here. In spite of the fact it's so incredibly progressive in this area. But anyway, let me continue. I just wanted it evident by the fact that at this Walmart at this particular moment there happened to be 2 concealed carriers in the parking lot at that time. It says police responded to calls about a drunk driver that was driving the wrong way down the street. When they arrived, they heard gunshots down the road, and it was learned that a man was attempting to carjack people at gunpoint. During these attempted carjackings, a 16-year-old girl was injured. The Blaze reports. The suspect then proceeded to a local Walmart where he attempted to steal 2 additional cars. In one attempted carjacking, the suspect shot a man twice, leaving him in critical condition. That's when, according to the Seattle Times, 2 men armed with concealed firearms drew their sidearm and approached the carjacker. Carjacker. One man discharged his weapon, killing the gunman. This man, who ultimately subdued the carjacker, was a father walking with his family. Okay. Then there was another incident at a Colorado Walmart. A concealed carrier did not have the opportunity to stop this shooting. A man walked in, started opening fire. He killed 2 people, I believe, or he shot 2 people. Multiple people in the Walmart were later seen on security footage drawing their firearms and preparing to respond to the situation. This is one of those situations that unfolded rather quickly. The man basically ran in, shot a bunch of people, ran out. He ran in, emptied a magazine, and ran out. So he was able to flee the scene before anybody actually was able to get there, even the people that were on the scene responding. But the police chief made some ridiculous statement later that, all the concealed carriers pulling their firearms sure made our job difficult discerning who the shooter was after the fact. going through surveillance footage, and that's just ridiculous. He wasn't talking about, oh, it was real confusing when we got to the scene, all these people with their guns. He was saying, oh, you know, my job's a little harder now because I have to go through all this footage and see these other people who clearly are not anywhere near the incident or involved pulling their firearms. It's just ridiculous. But the fact is, there were multiple people there that day prepared and ready to stop that shooter, and likely would have had he continued to fire. The incident unfolded too quickly for anybody to really react. But had his intent been to stay and do as much harm as possible, he likely would have been stopped. So what we see is a pattern of these shootings in non-gun-free zones. There tends to be people on the scene responding to them immediately. Now, I have to keep saying it because people are dumb and can't just accept an argument is what an argument is. I'm not saying that it's going to solve every situation. I'm not saying that a concealed carrier might not respond to a situation and accidentally harm a bystander or accidentally shoot the wrong person. That could happen. But a police officer could accidentally do the same thing as what happened with Jonathan Hurley. Police officers are not as trained in shootings as you think they are. Evident by Uvalde. They had training on how to respond to that situation, and they stood around with their thumbs up their asses for fucking 67 minutes and did nothing. Oh, well, no, they did. They stopped other people from trying to take action. There were multiple people that brought their own firearms or had their own firearms that tried to go in and stop that shooter. And those fucking cowards, the only thing they managed to do in that 67 minutes was stop other people from doing their job that they were refusing to do. And I'm sorry, I understand. You can't, you know, some of you were following orders. Some of you might have been scared. And I understand you can't, you can't control the way you respond to a situation like that. Once bullet starts flying, some people might decide this isn't the right job for me. But first of all, you need to decide at that moment that's not the right job for you and walk away because you chose to walk away from the gunfire. Second of all, if you chose, while you heard gunshots being fired in a room that you knew not only civilians but children were in, and you chose to listen to that stand down order for 67 minutes, you're a coward. You had a responsibility as a man to ignore that order and do what was right. And when you didn't do that, to further stop other people from doing the right thing just proves you knew you were doing the wrong thing and you didn't want somebody else to cement that fact. Because if somebody else would have stopped that shooting while you were standing right there with your shield, your body armor, and your rifles, that would have looked pretty bad, wouldn't it? Bet you were really hoping that surveillance footage didn't get out. And I'm not putting that on all police officers, just the ones there that day that chose to listen to those orders. Some people might feel that that's unfair for me to say because how could I expect them to run towards the gunfire? Well, for one, I would have a lot more sympathy if they didn't stop other people who were willing to run towards the gunfire. But for two, because they put their hand up and they volunteered and said, I will be the person that will run towards the gunfire when you call. That's what we pay them for. That's why we give them permissions that the rest of us don't have to defend ourselves. So that's why. That's how. Anyway, so the idea that this, back to the point, the idea that the CNN article is is trying to round off this article by telling people how bad it was that this man responded is just fucking gross. Thank God he was there, and thank God he responded, and thank God there wasn't a Uvalde police officer there to stop him from responding. The shooter had, he had no real criminal history. He had a couple prior interactions with police, including a fight at school. I believe he was out of school at this point. I don't think he was in college, but I believe when he was a juvenile, police had responded to a fight at school that he was in, and he had also been contacted or reported as a runaway at some point as a juvenile, but he had no adult record. So that's the situation. Don't let this drift away into people's memory, particularly like Colorado. I had completely forgotten about Colorado and Jonathan Hurley until it was mentioned in this article, because we know the news media is going to let this one bury as quick as possible because it does not meet their particular agenda. But I do find it weird. Oh, so real quick, one other point that I was making. They did mention earlier in the article about how there had been 400 and some mass shootings this year, and yet there had only been 434 active shooters since 2000, so 21 years. They really tried to make it look like it's, just multiplied exponentially. We already talked about how that figure from Gun Violence Archive of 400 and some mass shootings so far this year is completely absurd. That includes armed robberies, it includes gang violence, it includes domestic violence, it includes all sorts of things that are not what is understood to be a mass shooting by the general public, which would be much closer to that definition of an active shooter situation. Namely that it happens in a public place and that the intent is to harm random citizens. That's the big definition difference between what CNN and the Gun Violence Archive use as a mass shooter statistic and what that other organization, I don't have it up anymore, but that other organization used as an active shooter definition. That's the big difference. Obviously, it's just an attempt to inflate the numbers, because what's the point of combining all those things that nobody considers a mass shooting into that number? It's just obfuscation and an attempt to cause fear. I don't know how else to put it. I do want to say that it's quite odd, and I'm not trying to float some conspiracy theory, and I'm not even drawing any conclusions here. I just want to say that it's odd that we have seen this uptick in actual active shooter situations as we once again approach an election, and once again, gun control legislation is attempted to be passed. It sure seems these things don't happen after the situation. They happen before, which is odd. I don't know if, if I had to guess, and I'm just putting out a possibility here because I have no idea if there's a correlation, if it's entirely random. I'm definitely not saying there's causation, but if I had to guess, something about all of the rhetoric about gun violence might encourage people to act on those desires. I'm not sure, but that, I think, is exactly why that problem, that question that needs to be asked, I think is exactly why, as tough as it will be and as uncomfortable as it feels to even suggest doing, going through that manifesto that was left by one of the active shooters over the last year is worth doing. And it's going to take me a long time to go through and clear out, anything that is not a good idea to share publicly. But there are things in there that need to be known. And if nothing else, the general public needs to be aware of the intentions of these guys so that we can be better aware of how to respond, how to stop all of these incidents. Any information that these deranged individuals give us that tells us when, where, why, how they chose to act can help us stop these massacres. And we need to take advantage of that, as difficult as it may be to do. So I'm going to end this right here. I just wanted to make sure that this got out there. I want to say, on behalf of everybody, thank you, Elisjsha Dicken, for responsibly carrying your firearm, being trained and prepared on how to use it, and running towards a dangerous situation to save other people's lives. He put himself in danger for literally no selfish reason. He didn't have body armor. He didn't necessarily have the best weapon to handle the situation. The police officer said he engaged at a remarkably long distance for a handgun. Meanwhile, the active shooter that he was facing had a rifle far more capable of taking him out than he had of taking the shooter out. And he still chose to engage. And he immediately, from the moment he fired the first shot, brought an end to the rampage. So thank you. And thank God you were there and spared potentially so many other people from losing their lives that day. With that, anchor.fm/JBU. Send me an email, jbu@usa.com. My name is Chris, and this has been Just Between Us.